Okay, so now let's look to see how we can use what we've talked about to be able to solve this story problem using a system of inequalities. It says an electronics firm makes two kinds of televisions, plasma and projection. The firm assumes it will sell all the sets it makes. It profits $2,000 on each plasma set it sells and $1,500 on each projection TV. If it wants a profit of over $100,000, how many plasma sets and how many projection TVs should it make? Well, since we're dealing with plasma TVs and projection TVs, it doesn't make sense for me to use P there for my variable. So I'm just going to use X and Y. I'll use X to represent my plasma TVs, and let's use Y to represent our projection TVs. So knowing that, I could set up an inequality here where we would have, it's $2,000 that they make on each plasma TV, so it's going to be 2,000 X plus they make $1,500 on each projection TV, so $1,500 on each projection would be 1,500 times Y. They want to profit over $100,000, so it's going to be greater than 100,000. Now that's going to be our first inequality. Now notice I said it's my first inequality, and notice earlier I said that we're going to solve a system of inequalities here. But there's no other numbers, so what are other inequalities going to be? Well, for the other two inequalities that we need to come up with, I call these our common sense inequalities. In math, there's no such thing as just taking things for granted and just saying, well, isn't that common sense? We have to have something to define that. What I'm getting at is the fact that we know there's never going to be a negative amount of plasma TVs, and there's never going to be a negative amount of projection TVs. So I'm going to have two other inequalities here to say X is greater than or equal to 0, and Y is greater than or equal to 0. And again, I refer to these first two as our common sense inequalities. Now that's really not their name, but that's just an easy way to remember them. So anytime I refer to, don't forget your common sense inequalities, that's what I'm referring to. Okay, so now let's see how we would graph this. Well, we looked at in that previous video the fact that if I have X is greater than or equal to 0 and Y is greater than or equal to 0, that means that I'm focusing on quadrant 1. All of our solution set is only going to be in quadrant 1. And that's what that means. So I don't really need to graph those. If you want to, you can. But again, all you're doing is you're creating your X and Y axis and emphasizing the quadrant 1 there. But let's look at this other inequality. We want to find, this is in standard form. So I want to find the X and Y intercepts here. My X intercept is going to be when Y is 0. If I cover up the Y, so this way I can focus on the X-intercept. If I would do this now, or to find the X-intercept, I divide both sides by 2,000, which gives me an X-intercept of 50. So I'm going to count by tens. So I'm going to put that down here so I know that I'm counting by tens. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. That's right there. So now, to find my Y-intercept, I'm going to cover up my X because the Y-intercept is where X is 0. When I do that, 100,000 divided by 1,500 gives me 66.67. Well, we're not going to sell 66.67 TVs, so we want to round this up since we're looking to make more than 100,000. I want to round this one up, so we're going to take and graph this and treat this as 67. So when I estimate, I'm going to count by tens here, so I'm going to have to estimate where this is going to be. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. 65 would be halfway, so 67 would be a little over halfway. Now it's going to be greater than that, not greater than or equal to, so I'm going to connect these now with a dashed line. And I want to see if I shade above or below here, so this one is in standard form, so you can't assume that we would shade above it just because it says greater than. We need to use a point not on the line, like 0, 0. And if I put 0 in for X and 0 in for Y, I get 0 on the left side is greater than 100,000, which is a false statement, meaning 0, 0 is not a solution, so none of the points below the line are a solution. So that means my feasible region, my solutions, are all going to be in this area here. That would be your answer. So now why don't you see if you can set up your two systems of inequalities for this next story problem. I'm sorry, there's going to be three inequalities here that you're going to graph. Remember, your common sense ones. And then go ahead and use what we've learned so far to be able to graph those and see if you can find the feasible region. So why don't you pause the video and hit play when you're ready to check your work. Okay, so you should have had a chance to try that, so let's see what you came up with here. Let's use, it says the geraniums are $4 each, so I'm going to use G for geranium, so it'll be 4G, plus, it's $2.50 for each basket of petunias. We'll use P for petunias. And we want to make a profit of $500 or more, so that's going to be greater than or equal to 500. And then we're not going to have a negative amount of petunias, and we're not going to have a negative amount of geraniums. We'll use P, well, I guess let's use G as our x-axis, and we'll use P as our y-axis. So to figure out what my G-intercept would be for this one, I would take 500 and divide by 4. When you do that, you get 125. So my G-intercept is at 125, so let's count by 25s here. So 25, 50, 75, 100, 125 would be right here. So now to find the P-intercept, I'll replace G with 0, so I'm going to take 500 divided by 2.5, and when I do that, I'm going to get, 500 divided by 2.5 gives me 200 as my answer. So count by 25s here as well, so 25, 50, let's make note of that then. 25, 50, 75, 100, 25, 50, 75, 200 would be right here. We're going to use a solid line for this. And again, recognize the fact that these are going to be in quadrant 1. So if you could do arrows beyond this, but just the reason why I stop these and don't put arrows on the end, it reminds me that we're being limited to the first quadrant here. Now I want to see, do I shade above or below the line? 0, 0, does that make a true statement? If I put 0 and 0 in here, I get 0 is greater than 500 or equal to 500, which is false, so you would end up shading above the line here. Okay, so this is how we use inequalities to solve story problems. So hopefully between these two videos you have a pretty good understanding of what you're supposed to be doing. So good luck on your assignment.